A wave taller than a five-story building just crashed through the Mediterranean Sea. And what happened next changed everything we thought we knew about this ancient body of water. On the night of January 20th, 2026, something impossible occurred. An oceanographic buoy floating in the dark waters between Sicily and Malta recorded a measurement that made scientists question their equipment. 16 meters. That is roughly 52 feet of solid water rising from the Mediterranean like a liquid mountain. This was not the Atlantic Ocean. This was not the Pacific. This was the Mediterranean. A sea that most people picture as calm, blue, peaceful. A sea where tourists swim and fishermen cast their nets. A sea that has cradled human civilization for thousands of years. And now, for the first time in recorded history, it had produced a wave that could swallow a building whole. By morning, the world woke up to images that seemed fake. Entire coastlines had been erased. Beaches that had existed for generations were simply gone. Harbor walls that had stood for centuries lay in rubble. And across southern Italy, people emerged from their homes to find a landscape transformed by violence they never imagined possible. This was no ordinary storm. Cyclone Harry had arrived, a rare Mediterranean hurricane known as a metacane, and it had torn through southern Italy with a fury that meteorologists are calling a once-in-a-century phenomenon. The damage toll now exceeds €2 billion. Thousands of people were displaced. Critical infrastructure was destroyed, and a question now haunts scientists across Europe. A question that is terrifying in its simplicity. If this is what a warming Mediterranean can produce, what comes next? To understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning. We need to understand what turned a regional storm into a continental catastrophe. We need to know why Italy's most advanced warning systems failed to prepare communities for what was coming. And we need to ask whether this could be only the beginning of a new era of Mediterranean destruction. The numbers arrived like dispatches from a war zone. In the Zara del Vallo on Sicily's western coast, wave sensors recorded heights exceeding 8 meters. That is roughly 26 feet of churning Mediterranean fury slamming into the shore. Off the coast of Catania, the sea surged past 5 meters. Seawalls that had protected the city for decades were breached in minutes. Streets that had been dry and safe became rivers within the hour. But the most staggering measurement came from that buoy position south of Sicily. 16 meters. A wall of water that shattered every record in Mediterranean maritime history. Think about that for a moment. The Mediterranean Sea is essentially a large, enclosed basin. It connects to the Atlantic Ocean only through the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. Its waves are typically measured in single digits. Sailors have crossed these waters for thousands of years with reasonable confidence in what to expect. And then, in a single night, all of that changed. The sea produced something it had never produced before. Something that should not have been possible. The rainfall was equally devastating. In San Sosti, a small town in Calabria's Ionian Hills, weather stations recorded nearly 570 millimeters of precipitation in just 72 hours. Let that number sink in. That single reading represents more rain than the region typically receives in 4 months. All of it falling in 3 days. The water had nowhere to go. Saturated hillsides began to slide. Ancient olive groves that had clung to slopes for generations were swept away in walls of mud. Rivers exceeded their banks in hours. Not days. Hours. The transformation was so rapid that people had no time to react. They went asleep with the sound of rain on their roofs. They woke up to find their world underwater. Wind speeds across the storm's core reached 130 kilometers per hour. Gusts climbed even higher. These figures stunned forecasters who had tracked Mediterranean cyclones for decades. They had models. They had historical data. They had sophisticated computer simulations. None of it had prepared them for Cyclone Harry. The storm's wind field stretched across the Tyrrhenian and Ionian seas simultaneously. It battered 3 major regions at once: Sicily, Sardinia, Calabria, all under assault from a ferocity the Mediterranean simply does not produce. Except now it does. But the raw data only hints at what unfolded on the ground. The term metacane sounds almost clinical. It is a portmanteau of Mediterranean and hurricane. A neat scientific label that masks the brutal reality of what these storms can become. Unlike tropical hurricanes that draw their power from warm equatorial waters, metacanes are born from collision. From the violent meeting of cold Arctic air masses with an abnormally warm sea surface. The process begins innocuously enough. A low-pressure system drifts over the Mediterranean basin. It typically arrives from the Atlantic. Above it, cold air from northern Europe creates a stark temperature gradient with the warm water below. This thermal instability triggers convection. Moisture is pulled upward in towering columns of storm clouds. If conditions align precisely, if wind shear remains low enough and the sea surface warm enough, the system can undergo what meteorologists call tropical transition. What emerges is a compact and ferocious cyclone with an eye-like structure at its center. A Mediterranean monster. The Channel of Sicily is the Mediterranean's most prolific nursery for these storms. Here, warm Libyan air meets Tyrrhenian currents in a convergence zone that can rapidly intensify developing systems. Cyclone Harry followed this ancient pathway with devastating efficiency. Its warm core strengthened as it fed on waters that had absorbed months of excess heat. It grew hungrier with every passing hour. And by the time it reached its peak intensity, it had become something unprecedented. Scientists track roughly 1 to 2 metacanes per year. Most dissipate within days. Their relatively modest intensity is limited by the Mediterranean's modest dimensions. There simply is not enough open water to sustain truly massive storms. Or so the thinking went. But Harry defied these patterns entirely. The storm's 72-hour rampage produced the highest waves, the heaviest rainfall, and the most sustained winds of any Mediterranean cyclone in the modern record. The question scientists are now asking is why. Why did this storm become so powerful? Why did it exceed every prediction? And the answer lies beneath the surface, in waters that have been warming relentlessly for 4 decades. According to Mercator Ocean International, the first half of 2025 was the warmest semester ever recorded for the Mediterranean Sea. Surface temperatures averaged well above historical norms. The previous record, set just 1 year earlier, was shattered. By summer, 98% of the Mediterranean was experiencing what scientists call marine heatwave conditions. The Tyrrhenian Sea, directly beneath Harry's track, recorded anomalies of 5 to 6 degrees Celsius above normal. If you are finding this story as fascinating as I do, take a moment to hit that subscribe button and like this video. It helps us bring you more content like this. This excess heat is rocket fuel for cyclones. Warm water pumps moisture and energy into the atmosphere at rates that amplify every storm process. Evaporation intensifies. Convection deepens. Latent heat release accelerates. A storm that might have peaked as a strong gale instead becomes something approaching true hurricane intensity. The Mediterranean had been storing energy for months, and Cyclone Harry released it all at once. The Mediterranean has been accelerating toward this moment since the 1980s. Research published in Frontiers in Marine Science confirms that 2024 was the hottest and most dynamically energetic year for Mediterranean waters in 4 decades. The warming continued into 2025 without pause. By June of that year, sea surface temperatures off the Spanish coast had reached 30 degrees Celsius, a threshold previously considered impossible for the region. When Cyclone Harry swept across these superheated waters in January 2026, it found a sea prime to amplify its every destructive impulse. The resulting transformation was swift and catastrophic. The storm made no distinctions in its targets. Sicily, Sardinia, and Calabria found themselves under simultaneous assault. Their populations were caught between converging bands of wind and rain with no shelter adequate to protect them. Italy's Civil Protection Department declared the highest emergency status, a red alert across all 3 regions. Schools closed in more than 150 municipalities. Public parks, cemeteries, and markets were shuttered to protect citizens from falling trees and flying debris. But the warnings came too late for many coastal communities. On Sicily's eastern shore, firefighters conducted boat rescues through flooded streets. Automobiles that had been parked safely the night before had become floating hazards. In Sardinia, approximately 100 people were evacuated from low-lying districts of Cagliari as seawater penetrated inland. The Calabrian city of Catanzaro saw its Lido district partially submerged. Emergency services responded to nearly 90 calls in a single morning. And the calls kept coming. The storm's reach extended to the smallest islands. Ferry services to Pantelleria and the Pelagie Islands were suspended entirely. Residents were stranded. Supply lines were severed. The Aeolian Islands, the volcanic archipelago north of Sicily, were cut off from the mainland as shipping came to a complete halt. For those trapped on these isolated outposts, there was nothing to do but wait and watch the sea rage. The collective impact was staggering. Firefighters across the 3 regions responded to more than 1,600 emergency incidents within the storm's first 48 hours. Some operations required inflatable dinghies to navigate flooded neighborhoods. Others involved extracting families from homes whose ground floors had become underwater corridors. Children were carried through chest-deep water. Elderly residents were lifted from windows. The scenes were repeated across hundreds of communities. Yet the full scale of devastation would only become clear in the storm's aftermath. Catania became the storm's ground zero. Sicily's second-largest city, home to more than 300,000 people, it experienced a storm surge unlike anything in living memory. The sea, whipped to frenzy by sustained winds, invaded the city's coastal districts with walls of debris-laden water. The surge came without warning for many. One moment the streets were wet but passable. The next moment they were impassable rivers. Fishing boats were torn from their moorings in the harbor. One vessel sank directly at the dock. Its loss was lamented by fishermen who had warned for years about inadequate port maintenance. They had asked for stronger barriers. They had requested deeper dredging. Their warnings had been dismissed as alarmist. Now their boats lay underwater. The flooding pushed inland with terrifying speed. Historic squares that had witnessed centuries of human activity disappeared beneath brown water. Coastal restaurants were gutted as waves crashed through windows. Furniture was propelled across dining rooms in scenes captured by security cameras and shared across social media. Viral footage showed the Mediterranean literally entering buildings. Water surging under glass panels. Elegant interiors transformed into churning chaos within seconds. These videos were watched millions of times around the world. People could not believe what they were seeing. Dozens of families were forced to abandon their homes. Emergency crews worked through the night to relocate residents from ground-floor apartments where water had risen above waist height. The district's drainage systems, never designed for such volumes, failed completely. Streets that had been thoroughfares became rivers. They flowed toward the overwhelmed sea. There was nowhere for the water to go but through the city. In the Sicilian seaside village of Punta Secca, the storm claimed something irreplaceable. The Enzo Ferrara restaurant, a landmark immortalized in the beloved television series Inspector Montalbano, suffered extensive damage as waves battered its waterfront location. Fans of the show had traveled from around the world to dine there, to sit where the fictional detective had sat. Now the windows were shattered. The furniture was destroyed. The magic was broken. Nearby, the entire Antica beach was erased from the coastline. Its sand and structures were pulled into the churning Mediterranean. A beach that had existed for as long as anyone could remember simply ceased to exist in a single night. For the Ferrara family, who had operated a small pension near the harbor for 3 generations, the storm brought a reckoning with forces beyond comprehension. They had weathered Mediterranean storms before. They knew the routine. Board the windows. Move valuables to upper floors. Wait for it to pass. But nothing had prepared them for this. The surge arrived after midnight. A sound like thunder that never stopped. By dawn, the ground floor was buried in sand, debris, and the wreckage of neighboring structures. Everything they had built was gone. We thought we knew the sea. The family's eldest son would later tell reporters. We were wrong. The words carried a weight that extended far beyond one family's loss. Across southern Italy, communities were discovering that their understanding of Mediterranean weather had become dangerously obsolete. The rules their grandparents had taught them no longer applied. The patterns their ancestors had lived by for centuries had been broken. Near Santa Teresa di Riva, a coastal road along the Messina seafront simply ceased to exist. The storm surge carved a crater through the asphalt. It created a void that swallowed a vehicle. The elderly driver had ignored closure warnings. Rescue crews extracted him from the wreckage and transported him to a hospital in nearby Taormina. He survived, but the incident prompted furious criticism from civil protection officials. Danilo Lo Giudice, the town's mayor, surveyed the devastation. He reached for wartime language. "It looks like a war bulletin," he said. The comparison was not exaggeration. The destruction was systematic, comprehensive, overwhelming. The road collapse was merely the most dramatic of countless infrastructure failures. On the Ionian coast near Scaletta Zanclea, storm waves literally undermined the railroad tracks connecting Messina, Catania, and Syracuse. In some sections, the rails were left suspended in midair. Their supporting embankments had been washed away by the relentless surge. The disruption severed one of Sicily's most critical transportation arteries during the height of the emergency. Catania's central station flooded. Control infrastructure was compromised. Multiple rail corridors were suspended. The Palermo-Catania line was halted. The Syracuse-Caltanissetta route fell silent. Passengers found themselves stranded. The island's transportation network collapsed into isolated fragments. Getting anywhere became almost impossible. Major highways fared little better. State Road 114 in Sicily and State Road 195 in Sardinia were closed due to flooding and debris accumulation. Near Tortoli in Sardinia, a falling tree struck a moving vehicle. The two occupants were injured. The incident underscored the lethal danger that persisted even far from the immediate coastline. This was not just a coastal storm. Its effects reached deep inland. Emergency repairs began immediately. Work crews were deployed around the clock. But civil protection officials acknowledged a brutal reality. They could not fix infrastructure faster than a storm could destroy it. They were playing catch-up with a disaster that kept expanding. The Aeolian Islands experienced an overnight transformation, from volcanic paradise to maritime prison. As Harry's wind field expanded across the Tyrrhenian Sea, all ferry and hydrofoil services connecting the seven-island archipelago to mainland Sicily were suspended. There was no way off the islands, and no way to get supplies in. Residents who had lived their entire lives surrounded by relatively calm Mediterranean waters watched waves crash over port facilities. These facilities had been designed for gentle swells. They had never been tested against anything like this. Seawater invaded roads, then homes, then spaces people had considered safe. The isolation was complete. On the mainland, vulnerable populations required urgent attention. In Messina, authorities evacuated an entire nursing home as a precautionary measure. Elderly residents were relocated before floodwaters could threaten the facility. The operation was delicate, time-sensitive. It was repeated across multiple municipalities as conditions worsened. In the small fishing village of Marzamimi, exposed directly to wave action on Sicily's southeastern tip, officials ordered a full precautionary evacuation. The ancient harbor community had coexisted with the Mediterranean for centuries. It had weathered countless storms. But this was different. Conditions exceeded all historical precedent. There was no choice but to leave. Approximately 190 people across Sicily left their homes during the storm's peak. The number seems modest until one considers what it represents. Families abandoning everything they owned. Because the sea had become something unrecognizable, something hungry, something that no longer followed the rules their ancestors had lived by for centuries. In Calabria, the sky simply refused to stop giving. The 570 millimeters of rain that fell on San Sosti was not merely a record. It was an event so far outside normal parameters that existing flood models became meaningless. The computer simulations could not account for something that had never happened before. The ground, already saturated from previous autumn rainfall, could absorb nothing. Every additional drop became runoff. It sought the lowest elevation with remorseless efficiency. Water flows downhill, and when there is enough of it, nothing can stand in its way. Rural roads began to fail first. Pavement collapsed as water undermined foundations that had held for decades. Craters opened in provincial routes. Familiar commutes became obstacle courses of mud and debris. Landslides blocked mountain passes. Hill towns that had stood for centuries found themselves cut off from emergency services. The cascading failures extended to critical infrastructure. In one incident that crystallized the storm's danger, firefighters had to rescue an electrical utility technician who became trapped in floodwaters. He had been attempting to maintain electrical infrastructure, to keep power flowing to hospitals and emergency services. The rescue operation highlighted a terrible irony. Those working to help others were themselves becoming casualties of the storm's intensity. Transportation networks buckled across the region. Reggio Calabria Airport diverted incoming flights as visibility collapsed and runway conditions deteriorated. Flights to Pantelleria and Lampedusa faced similar disruptions. The aviation safety implications extended far beyond inconvenience. Medical evacuations, emergency resupply missions, and rescue helicopter operations all faced weather-imposed limits. Help could not reach where it was needed most. In the Lido di Porto Salvo, the sea claimed 100 meters of seafront in a single surge. The regional governor noted with evident relief that there were no fatalities. But the material destruction defied easy calculation. Initial estimates for Calabria alone approached hundreds of millions of euros. Final tallies were expected to climb substantially higher as damage assessments continued. The region had experienced bad storms before. It had never experienced anything like this. The cameras captured what words could not convey. In the Zara del Vallo, footage showed waves exceeding 8 meters crashing against coastal defenses with explosive force. The spray rose higher than buildings. The sound was deafening even through phone speakers. In Catania, security cameras documented the precise moment Mediterranean waters invaded a restaurant dining room. Chairs and tables tumbled through the frame like toys in a bathtub. The footage went viral within hours. Off eastern Sicily, waves exceeding 12 meters were documented during the storm's most violent phase. Nearly 40 feet. These were not Mediterranean waves. These were ocean waves. The kind of swells generated by Atlantic hurricanes and Pacific typhoons. Their appearance in the relatively enclosed Mediterranean basin challenged fundamental assumptions about what regional weather systems could produce. Sardinia's coastline emerged unrecognizable. The regional governor estimated damage in the hundreds of millions of euros for her island alone. Popular summer beaches, including Poeto, La Sella, and Batos near Olbia, were transformed beyond recognition. Mountains of Posidonia seagrass, torn from the seafloor by unprecedented wave action, buried sand and invaded coastal roads. The cleanup would take months, perhaps years. Highway 195 along Sardinia's southwestern coast suffered extensive damage from storm surge. The erosion was so severe that some sections would require complete reconstruction. Initial assessments suggested the repair timeline would extend well beyond the coming tourist season. This threatened an economy heavily dependent on summer visitors. The storm had not just destroyed infrastructure. It had threatened livelihoods. Across all 3 affected regions, early estimates placed total damage above 2 billion euros. The Sicilian regional government launched formal procedures to request a state of emergency. Infrastructure ministers called for emergency declarations covering Sicily, Calabria, and Sardinia simultaneously. Officials discussed applications to the European Union Solidarity Fund. They acknowledged that domestic resources alone could not address destruction of this magnitude. But the financial calculations masked a more fundamental reckoning. Scientists have been warning for years that the warming Mediterranean would eventually produce extreme weather events of unprecedented intensity. Those warnings have now been validated in the most devastating manner possible. Cyclone Harry was not an anomaly. It was not a freak occurrence. It was not bad luck. It was a preview. The Mediterranean Sea has warmed approximately 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. The acceleration is visible in every successive year's data. Marine heat waves that once occurred occasionally now persist for months. The warm water that supercharged Harry's development is not temporary. It is the new baseline, the new normal. And that normal is getting more extreme every year. Climate researchers have identified a troubling paradox. Global warming may actually reduce the frequency of Mediterranean cyclones. More stable atmospheric conditions mean fewer storms overall. But the storms that do form will tap into vastly more energy. They will become more intense, more destructive, more capable of overwhelming infrastructure designed for a different climate. The Calabria Regional Civil Protection Director called Harry a once-in-a-century event. But if Mediterranean warming continues at current rates, such events may recur far more frequently. The 100-year storm may become the 50-year storm, then the 20-year storm. The sea that has defined southern Italian life for millennia is transforming into something unfamiliar. A reservoir of energy waiting to fuel the next catastrophe. We know what Cyclone Harry destroyed. We know the waves reached heights never before recorded in Mediterranean history. We know the rainfall exceeded all previous measurements. We know the damage will require years and billions of euros to repair. What we do not know is whether this was the worst the Mediterranean can produce, or whether it was merely a demonstration of what lies ahead. The survivors of southern Italy's once-in-a-century storm now face a future shaped by that uncertainty. They will rebuild their homes. They will repair their roads. They will restore their harbors. They will plant new crops in fields still crusted with sea salt. They will return to lives interrupted by forces they never imagined possible. But the Mediterranean they knew is gone. In its place churns a sea transformed by decades of human carbon emissions. A sea capable of generating storms that erase beaches and sink harbors. A sea that has only begun to reveal its new potential for destruction. If the official risk assessments were wrong about Harry, what else have they missed? If the Mediterranean can produce waves taller than 5-story buildings, what boundaries remain? If this was only the beginning, what does the next once-in-a-century storm look like? And how soon will it arrive? These questions now hang over every coastal community from Gibraltar to the Bosphorus, from Barcelona to Beirut, from Venice to Alexandria. Millions of people live along these shores. Their cities, their homes, their lives exist at the edge of a sea that has changed. The Mediterranean has sent its message. The only question now is whether we are listening.